Welcome to Vermont Voices. I'm Sharice Madigan, and today we're joined by Bennington Representative Brian Keefe. Representative Keefe, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Sharice.
Could you start by telling me a little bit about yourself and your career in politics?
Well, my career has lasted about 7 months so far, but I grew up in Vermont. I was born in Montpelier while my parents lived in Waterbury, where my dad grew up on a farm there. And I started with Senator Jeffords back in 1987 in Washington, D.C., and then my wife Leslie and I moved up here to Manchester in 1992, I think. I continued to work for Senator Jeffords for a total of about 15 years. And then I went to work for Central Vermont Public Service as the Vice President of Government Affairs. So that got me involved more intensely in state politics. I was on the chair of the Planning Commission for several years. And then I was just, a parent and I was out of politics per se until last year when I decided to run for this seat. And I'm just completed my first year of the first session.
That's great. And what made you want to represent Manchester and the surrounding towns?
Well, I've been interested in politics, as you can tell, but raising kids and living in the South, it's not easy it's not easy for anyone to take the leap and actually go up to Montpelier and work up there on a part-time basis. But I saw Governor Scott running, and I liked his focus on the budget issues and on economic growth and on trying to hold the line on taxes and fees. And I wanted to support him. And I thought, if I run for the seat and if I can win it, then I can help support Governor Scott on those initiatives.
And how has your first year in the Senate been?
It was a lot of fun, really. It was good. I've had a lot of good feedback from local people, voters, supporters, some that maybe aren't supporters, but still I appreciate all the feedback, positive and negative. And we were able to, collectively, for the first time, pass a budget that's balanced without raising taxes, without raising fees. And in the end, there was a modest decrease in property tax rates. So I thought that was a huge success, and I credit the governor for his leadership in setting that tone, but also the Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate for executing on that, because it's a heavy lift to go through those appropriation bills line by line, and at the end of the day have two lines that say we're balanced. So yeah.
Absolutely. And the budget was very tough to get through. I know that just happened very recently. Could you tell me a little bit about the last week and how the budget finally passed?
So we had the veto session 2 days ago on Wednesday, June 21st. Longest day of the year.
I'm sure it felt like it.
There was a holdup over the way the savings from the change in the teachers' health insurance program would be treated. Mm-hmm. And the governor was insistent that taxpayers share in some of the savings, because the savings were, by moving to a different health care system, the savings were a total of $77 million, and about 2/3 of that would go back into the health insurance program to make the teachers whole, if you will, so they wouldn't lose on an insurance basis. And then there was a $26 million or so that were, do we put it back into education and spending programs, or do we give taxpayers a break? And the governor thought, and I agree, that taxpayers deserve a break after year after year after year after year of rising costs. And $26 million on one hand is not a huge thing when you look at the whole education funding, but it's real money, and people realize it's real money. And I think in the end we did split some of that savings. Some of it's going back into spending programs, which I don't disagree, there are needs in our schools, and some of it is going back to the taxpayers.
Absolutely. And the biggest opposition to the budget had been from teachers themselves, who were afraid that they were going to lose an important bargaining chip. How do you feel about their arguments, and how do you respond to their concerns directly?
I would put a finer point on it. I would think it's the teachers union and the teacher union leadership that was really the hardest opponents to this. And obviously they do represent teachers, but I did also hear from teachers who are taxpayers who were, fair is fair, that we have a statewide property tax that funds So maybe we should have a statewide health insurance program that's consistent across all school districts and supervisor unions rather than 60 different negotiating events. But at the same time, no, I understand. If I were a teacher, you have a right to collective bargaining. The district or the supervisor union is your employer, and to give up a valuable aspect of that bargaining is a big ask. Mm-hmm. And the trick was to find some way to allow some bargaining of that. In the end, we did not change it. In the end, it stays where it is, and we're going to do a study committee to see if there's a way we can move it to the state level in a way that's fair to the teachers so they don't lose from a negotiating point of view. But I just think most people believe that it's time for a complicated thing like health insurance programs to have one contract. The state employees, for example, are a state union. They have one contract. I just think, and we heard from a lot of school boards, and a lot of school board members said, look, this takes a lot of time. It's very complicated. Let's lift it up to the state level, resolve it once and for all at that level, and we can go back to talking about other issues like classroom time and school curriculums and things that are important to parents and students and teachers. So it's an important issue. There are two sides to it. It's not over, but in the meantime, I think we've got kind of a fair compromise.
That's always good to hear.
Yeah.
And another education issue that you've been very passionate about is Act 46. Could you tell me a little bit about the act and why you feel so strongly about it?
Well, I actually, during the campaign it came up a few times, but during the session it's kind of, in my mind, it's pretty much a settled issue. We didn't have I don't believe we had any bill or any vote related to Act 46. And in the meantime, of course, down in this area, certainly in Manchester and Sunderland, two of the towns that are in Cynthia and I's district, have formed a larger union of schools in compliance with Act 46. Arlington still has a way to go, and so does Sandgate. But back to your question, one of the problems I had with Act 46 is a problem I have with a lot of state policies in that they fit well in northern Vermont, where there are more people and schools are closer, than they do in southern Vermont, where we're not only are we more rural, but we also have a different culture with independent schools. There's a totally different mix of schools. Mm-hmm. So, for towns up north like Shelburne, Charlotte, Heinsberg, and Williston, I believe, they formed a larger union, a consolidated union, under the umbrella of CVU High School. Mm-hmm. It worked fine for them. They were already, everybody knows each other, they're close enough. And for that, they got a savings on their property tax for 5 years. The people did, as the incentive. It took us longer down here because it's a tougher call, and town by town it's more difficult, and we're still not through it. So, well, I take that back. There was a very important Act 46 vote, and it was non-controversial once it came out of committee, and that was to give these towns greater flexibility in their merger discussions. Okay. So I apologize. When I said there was no vote, there was no real controversial vote, there was no big pushback vote. Mm-hmm. What it was a vote on a bill to make it easier for the towns that are still out of compliance, like Arlington and Sandgate in this district, to come up with some solutions. They'll have a hard time.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that Southern Vermont has a different character and identity than Northern Vermont. For Manchester in particular and the surrounding towns that you represent, what do you think our biggest strengths are as a community?
Well, it's beautiful. Part is the environment is one huge asset. I grew up in Northern Vermont. I grew up in a town called Fairfax. I went to school. I graduated from Bellisfree Academy in Fairfax. So I have a lot of friends and family in Northern Vermont. I'm very familiar with Northern Vermont, yeah. And I've lived down here for 28 years, so I've come pretty familiar with here. And this is the best part of Vermont, as far as I can tell. It's the prettiest. Our climate's a little more moderate. We've got great recreation. We're that much closer to New York City, for example, which is a great place to visit. And we get a lot of course, second homeowners and tourists that come from that area. I mean, it's just a great part of Vermont. That's our greatest strength. We also have a very strong, in my mind, entrepreneurial spirit. There's a lot of people who are self-employed or have their own businesses, and that culture of self-reliance, it's a strong suit all across Vermont, but I think it by necessity, oftentimes, it has retained its strength around here. And I'll say, I think our second homeowners are a strength that, a very valuable part of our economy, and it's something that makes us a little different than Northern Vermont. There are Northern Vermont towns that have a similar mix of seasonal ownership, but as far as our culture, well, there's another one, the arts and culture and music. Artists, that's a big part of our economy, and that part of our economy is really helped by our second homeowners and tourists. So all of that brings us together in a way that I think is great. And I mean, I could go on as I sit here. Our schools are a huge asset.
Yes.
So I'll just stop for the sake of brevity, but there's a lot of great things about this region.
Absolutely. And where do you think that we have room to grow, politically, economically, or otherwise?
Well, in Manchester, for example, the outlet boom, if you will, that I've seen in my 28 years here is winding down, so to speak. It's still an important part, and I think a good part of our economy. But we also have new shops and new restaurants that are locally owned that are just great. So I think I'd like to see more. I hope to see more growth in that regard. We have a new hotel, the Taconic, and a new Hampton Inn coming in, and I think those hotels, with their reservation systems, the way everybody works online to book rooms and such, having major players like that located here trying to draw people here, I think that will draw more people here. Our recreation fields are getting better and better in Manchester, and Arlington has some great recreation fields as well. The little public golf course, the par 3, for the most part down there. My son and I played down there a lot when he was younger. The Battenkill River, the Green Mountain National Forest, all the hiking trails. My daughter and I hiked to Liebrook a couple weeks ago in the springtime, and so I think those recreation assets. I think we can continue to grow businesses related to tourism, which has always been a part of this economy. And I think we have space. I'm not one of those that thinks that we're overpopulated or things are going too fast. I think, I don't want us to, we're not going to grow out of control, but I think it's important that we see some steady growth.
Absolutely. And one of the ways the town has tried to foster and encourage that type of growth is through a new town plan and a new town zoning plan. Have you had any thoughts on the way the town is trying to move forward with attracting more full-time homeowners and second homeowners into town and encouraging those small businesses to propagate?
Yeah, I think the town's moving in the right direction. I've had some comments with Janet Hurley, who's the planning director and zoning administrator, and a couple of things. Increased, and I was on the planning commission for, I think, about a dozen years, and chaired it for many years. And increasing the density in the downtown areas for residential, I think is a good thing. We need more people living in the downtown. I live right in the downtown. It's a great place to live. It's a great place to be able to walk in and out of the Northshire bookstore, or I live near Seasons Cafe. It's a great little restaurant. It's nice to live there, and I think demographically a lot of more people are looking for that in their lives. Bill Drunzig did a great job with the former Factory Point Bank, and the other important change that's coming up, I think, is the changes in the rules to allow easier to convert some of the motels to workforce housing is the term that's being used. But I think some of these properties and the owners of these properties are looking for, okay, how can I get increased value from my properties? I've worked hard here in Manchester as a motel owner. It's not an easy business, and I think some of the changes that the town of Manchester is contemplating will make it easier for people to have some more choices on how they can bring more value out of their properties. And in turn, I think it'll be good for the town as you bring working people closer to the downtowns.
Absolutely. And something that has been rising in Manchester over the last few months is there's this group Move On Manchester, as well as some others, who have been seeing an upswing in kind of progressive activism. As a Republican representative for our area, how can you balance the views of these groups that are so kind of loud in this area with your own political beliefs and represent everyone fairly?
Yeah, so I have a lot of friends who are very active in the Move On group and Transition Manchester. There's various groups. You know, I like to see that activism. The Burn Burton had a group that came up to the State House. I think it was in April, and you know their views are a lot more aggressive, shall we say, than mine. That's the way it is. But I am so glad they have that energy and want to do these great things. And as far as moving to a more renewable economy, reducing carbon emissions, having a more mobile society without the use of vehicles, you know, the Manchester Riverwalk doing the great trail work downtown.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of room, there's a lot of space to share, to find common ground. And when I met with the kids, Jaden Lawler was one of the ones, and I've known him for years. He's my daughter's age, and you know, very smart, hopeful, involved young people. I think it's all great.
Absolutely. And in Vermont, I think we're lucky to have a stronger bipartisan atmosphere than a lot of states at this moment. How do you think that the legislature or politicians like yourself can kind of foster that open dialogue so more people say, it is great to see that energy, let's have a conversation?
Well, I think it's, you know, Montpelier is a lot different than Washington. We had a lot of bipartisan, the budget was the biggest of all, a lot of bipartisan support and work, a lot of complimentary comments, you know, the very, I think, positive energy for the most part. People in Montpelier can really disagree vehemently on different aspects of any issue. But it rarely gets personal. So I think that's good. You know, Washington just doesn't quite operate that way. I worked in Washington for about 4 years, and I worked for Jim Jeffords, who was very much a centrist, and I saw some of that, but it's gotten quite a bit worse, frankly.
Absolutely. And as a Vermont Republican, what are your thoughts on the National Republican Party at this moment in time?
Well, I think both parties are struggling to find out where their identity is going to be. We just had the big election in Georgia, a congressional election, which turned out to be the most expensive congressional election in history. And it points out, I think, on both sides that there's a real battle for the heart and soul of the parties, of both parties. So, I don't quite know where it's headed to, but I think if we tone down the rhetoric a little bit, it'd be easier to find that center.
Absolutely. And Governor Scott has been a strong voice against the policies coming out of Washington in a lot of cases, especially with immigration policies. What are your thoughts or a sense of how other Republicans in the state have responded to a Republican governor calling out a Republican president?
Quite frankly, there's not a lot of talk about it.
Yeah.
We had the one, I guess, the most indicative vote was Governor Scott, along with the Attorney General T.J. Donovan and others, had come up with a legislative package to give greater protections, if you will, for people who are here but not necessarily have all the paperwork in order. And you know, that was a bill that passed with bipartisan support. Yes, there were people that did not like that bill. I voted for it. I think for the most part I think what the governor wanted to do was realize the reality of reality, and try to find solutions at the state while we hopefully will find that. I mean, immigration policy and enforcement is something that needs to be solved at the national level. We can't really solve it at the state level, so we have to adapt to it meanwhile. And I think that's what that bill was, and I think the governor got a great bipartisan support for it. And we'll see. But even during that debate, I don't think I ever saw it rise to the level linking it to the Washington politics.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that that was a great bipartisan effort. What other efforts in the legislature this year have come across as kind of remarkably bipartisan?
Well, the budget
Yes.
for the number one, and we've talked about that, so I won't rehash all of it. But you know, we have this process with party caucuses that we do briefings, you know, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, and our highest ranking Republican on the Appropriations Committee would very regularly give us an update on how they were, and it was almost like a, you know, we're $125 million away from the target. Next to be we're $82 million, and then we're 21, and now we've got a gap of 6.32 million left to fill. So he would give us these updates and how that things were changing, and revenue forecasts would change and everything like that. But every time that he came in, just Peter Fagan from Rutland, he was so complimentary of Kitty Toll, who's the chair of that committee, and I think that committee really really shined and really showed that a bipartisan way to get to a budget solution. But there were many things. I mean, even the health insurance issue, you know, it was more one side than the other, and some of the votes were partisan. But there were some votes that were very, you know, that did split both caucuses. That's the way it is. In the end, each one of us, like each rep, like me, we represent our people here. So I represent Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and Sunderland. That's a different mix for the people that represent the city of Burlington. So you know, on some issues, and school issues are a lot of times that there's big differences. They just have a different type of system. They have more density. They have a more diverse population. There's a lot of differences. We have more independent schools. So how people represent their districts can be as important as which party they're from.
Absolutely. And speaking of this little area that we've got here in Manchester and Arlington and Sunderland, what do you hope to see for the future of these towns? How do you hope that we can grow and change over time?
Well, incrementally, you know, we've talked about some of the challenges of owning a business and growing businesses and the changing businesses. The strength of our schools, I mean, Arlington High School has had some amazing accomplishments over the years as far as being nationally recognized for their education programs. And, you know, Burton is a tremendous school. The independent schools are awesome. And I think our strength is in working together on a broader regional basis. You look at Bennington, which is very important to this region. We passed a TIF bill, which is a tax incentive program for downtowns. And Bennington might be the first out of the block for their project that they have envisioned and are working on down there. That bill passed with the support of all of the delegates down in this region. And you know, I've gotten to know some I knew already, but we have some very talented legislators that some new, but you know, Oliver Olson up in the mountain towns, Laura Sibilia in Wilmington, John Gannon, who's new from closer to Dover is Laura, and Wilmington is John. Linda Joy Sullivan, a new rep from Dorset. Very thoughtful, energetic people, and I think for the most, and we're different parties, Republicans, Independents, Democrats, but I think all of us recognize those common strengths in recreation, second home earners, schools. Economic development is important. Maintaining a control of our tax policies is important. And by sticking together, if we can, you know, control those fundamentals, people will want to come here, will want to stay here, to raise their family, to have a business, to live here, hopefully to retire here. So our strengths are where they've always been, in those fundamental, the beauty, recreation, and peacefulness of our region. So I hope we can continue to build on that.
Absolutely. Well, it seems like we're in good hands.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Representative Keefe.
Oh, thank you, Sharice. I've had a great time. Thank you.
And to learn more about the issues we've discussed today, keep an eye out for our column in the Manchester Journal. This has been Vermont Voices, viewing national news through a local lens. Have a great night.